Chai was born into a society where traditional gender roles dictated every aspect of life. In the village of Amishi, boys were expected to grow up strong, dominant, and aggressive, while girls were taught to be gentle and submissive. Any deviation from these expectations was seen as a flaw, something to be corrected by force if necessary. Unfortunately for Chai, he was different. From childhood, he had always been calm, reserved, and soft-spoken. His gentle nature, rather than being seen as a unique trait, was treated as a weakness. He was constantly scolded, insulted, and even beaten by his parents, who believed they could fix him by making him tougher. His mother, in particular, never let him forget that as a man, he would one day be the head of a household, and for that, he needed to be strong. But no matter how much they tried to change him, Chai remained true to himself, quiet, kind, and unwilling to conform to society's harsh expectations. As Chai grew older, the pressure on him only intensified. The ridicule from his peers, the harsh words from his parents, and the expectations of his community weighed heavily on him. He was constantly reminded that he did not fit the mold of what a man should be. The more he tried to stay true to himself, the more society pushed back, making him feel like an outcast. Every day was a battle against judgment, and despite his best efforts to ignore it, the emotional toll became unbearable. He longed for a place where he could simply exist without having to justify who he was. The realization hit him he would never find peace in Amici. If he wanted a chance at happiness, he needed to leave. With that thought in mind, he made the difficult decision to abandon the only home he had ever known. It was not an easy choice, but it was a necessary one. Packing up his few belongings, he set out to start anew, hoping that somewhere out there he would finally be accepted. She arrived in a village called Umun, where no one knew his past, and for the first time, he felt a sense of relief. Here, he was free from the constant scrutiny that had defined his life in Amici. Determined to make the most of his fresh start, he focused on his craft, creating beautiful tie-dye fabric designs. His talent quickly gained attention, and before long, he was able to make a decent living selling his work at the market. The villagers admired his skills and saw him as a hardworking man rather than an oddity. It was a stark contrast to the life he had left behind, and for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he had finally found a place where he belonged. But while Chue was able to escape his past physically, the scars of his upbringing lingered. The fear of being judged, of not being man enough, still haunted him. She had built a new life, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that one day, his true nature would once again be used against him. Chi had always hoped that love would bring him the peace he had long sought. When he met Aisama, he believed he had finally found someone who understood him. She was kind to him, thoughtful, and seemed to appreciate his gentle nature. They started as friends, often sharing meals and conversations that made Chai feel truly seen for the first time. It did not take long before his admiration for her grew into love, and when he proposed, Aisoma happily accepted. Their wedding was simple but joyous, and Chai felt hopeful about their future together. At first, married life seemed peaceful. Aisoma respected his calm demeanor, and though she sometimes wished he were more assertive, she never openly challenged him. Chai, on the other hand, was aware of Aisoma's short temper but dismissed it as a minor flaw they could work through. He believed that love, patience, and understanding would be enough to sustain their marriage. But everything changed when Aisoma became pregnant. It was as if a switch had flipped. She stopped helping around the house, demanding that Chai take care of all the chores. At first, he thought she was just exhausted from the pregnancy, so he took on more responsibilities without complaint. However, it quickly became clear that her behavior was not temporary. It was the beginning of something far worse. Over time, Aisoma's demands became more extreme, She no longer spoke to Chi with kindness, but instead ordered him around as if he were a servant. She refused to cook, clean, or do anything for herself, insisting that Chai handle everything. Whenever he tried to protest, she would lash out, accusing him of not caring about her or their unborn child. She, who had always been non-confrontational, found himself constantly giving in just to keep the peace. He convinced himself that her behavior was just a phase, something caused by the stress of pregnancy, and that things would return to normal once the baby arrived. But instead of improving, the situation worsened. Isoma became verbally abusive, belittling Chi whenever she could. She would call him weak, useless, and a disgrace, echoing the same words he had heard growing up. The emotional abuse soon turned physical. It started with small acts throwing objects at him, pushing him, slapping him when she was frustrated. She was too ashamed to tell anyone who would believe that a man was being abused by his wife. He suffered in silence, hoping that if he endured long enough, things would change. But the breaking point came one night when, in a fit of rage over a meal she didn't like, Isoma struck him hard across the face. That same night, she suffered a miscarriage. Chai rushed her to the hospital, devastated by the loss of their child. He thought the tragedy would bring them closer together, that it would remind them of what truly mattered. But for Isoma, the miscarriage only made her cruelty worse. In the months that followed, Isoma no longer treated Chai as her husband, but as a servant she could control. She made outrageous demands, forcing him to buy expensive things, and when he couldn't afford them, she would beat him and take his earnings by force. She dreaded coming home. The only peace he found was in his shop, where he could work without fear of being humiliated or attacked. But home had become a prison. His once loving wife had become his tormentor, and he felt powerless to stop it. Meanwhile, Isoma was secretly seeing another man. Chai had no idea that while he was breaking himself to please her, she was planning to leave him. He had endured so much, convincing himself that love required sacrifice. But what he didn't know was that Isoma had never truly loved him. She had only seen him as someone she could control, and soon she would prove just how disposable he was in her eyes. She never imagined that the woman he had loved so deeply would betray him in such a cruel way. He had endured Isoma's abuse for years, believing that one day she would return to the kind and caring person she once was. But one evening, everything changed. As Chai returned home from his shop, he found the house eerily quiet. His heart pounded as he searched for Isoma, only to find a handwritten note left on the table. With trembling hands, he read the words that shattered whatever hope he had left. "Dear ex-husband, I am leaving you for good. I have found a rich and strong man who knows how to take care of a woman, not a weakling like you. Don't bother looking for me because I am never coming back." Chai stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. After everything he had done for her, after all the sacrifices, the pain, the humiliation, she had simply walked away without a second thought. His emotions were a mix of devastation and relief. He had lost his wife, but in a way, he had also been freed from the nightmare that had consumed his life. That night, for the first time in years, Chai cried himself to sleep, not because he missed Isoma, but because he mourned the life he had wasted trying to please someone who never truly loved him. The days that followed were strange for Chi. He no longer had to tiptoe around his own home, fearing Isoma's wrath. He could wake up without dreading what kind of abuse he would endure that day. Yet, despite the newfound peace, he struggled with the weight of everything that had happened. He had spent so much time suppressing his pain, pretending that things would get better, only to be discarded like he meant nothing. One morning, while on his way to the market, he ran into a Wolai, Isoma's old friend, the only person who had ever noticed his suffering. When she asked how things had turned out, Chai simply told her the truth. Isoma had left him for another man. Away was shocked, but not surprised. She had seen the way Isoma treated him and had tried to warn her against such cruelty. She sympathized with Chi, admitting that she, too, had been a victim of an abusive marriage, though in her case, it had been at the hands of her husband. For the first time, Chai realized that pain was not exclusive to one gender. He had always believed that men were supposed to be strong, never showing weakness. But standing there with Owa, he understood that suffering was suffering was suffering, no matter who experienced it. 2 months later, news spread through the village. Isoma was dead. The man she had run away with turned out to be nothing like Che. He was aggressive, controlling, and had no patience for a woman who tried to dominate him. One night, during a heated argument, he violently pushed Isoma, causing her to hit her head on the floor. She died instantly. Rather than face the consequences, the man locked her lifeless body inside the house and fled. Days later, neighbors broke in after noticing the foul smell, only to discover her decomposing remains. She was stunned when he heard the news. Despite everything she had done to him, he never wished her harm. He felt a strange sadness, not for the woman who had tormented him, but for the life she had wasted in her pursuit of power and control. In time, she and Awa grew closer, bonded by their shared pasts. A year later, they married, building a life together based on mutual love and respect. She had finally found the peace he had always longed for, proving that even after great suffering, happiness was still possible. She had never imagined that his life would become a prison where the person he loved the most was also his greatest tormentor. In the beginning, he had believed that Isoma's treatment of him was temporary, something caused by the stress of pregnancy and loss. He had convinced himself that she would change, that her cruelty would fade, and that their marriage would one day resemble the love he had once dreamed of. But as time passed, it became clear that Isoma had no intention of changing. In fact, she became even more ruthless, treating Chi as though he were nothing more than a servant. She would wake up in the morning and demand that he cook her breakfast before he left for work. When he returned home exhausted from his shop, she would have an entire list of chores waiting for him. If he hesitated or tried to push back, she would lash out, sometimes with insults, other times with her fists. Chai endured it all in silence. He knew that no one would believe him if he spoke out. In their society, a man being abused by his wife was unheard of. He was supposed to be the strong one, the protector. If he complained, people would only laugh at him, call him weak, or tell him to be a man. And so he stayed, hoping that one day Isoma would grow tired of tormenting him. What Chai didn't know was that Isoma had already moved on. While he was breaking his back trying to keep their home running, she was secretly seeing another man. She no longer saw Chai as her husband, only as someone she could control. And when she realized that she no longer needed him, she made her final decision. One evening, after another long and exhausting day at the shop, Chai returned home to an empty house. At first, he thought Isoma had gone to visit a friend, but then he saw the note on the table. His hands shook as he read her final words. "Dear ex-husband, I am leaving you for good. I have found a real man. One who knows how to take care of a woman, not a weakling like you. Don't look for me because I am never coming back." Shai stood there staring at the paper, unable to move. A part of him felt like his world had just collapsed, but another part of him felt something unfamiliar relief. For years, he had lived in fear, walking on eggshells around his own wife, suffering in silence while everyone around him assumed his life was perfect. And now she was gone. The weight that had crushed him for so long was finally lifting. That night, for the first time in years, Chai slept peacefully, without fear of being woken by shouting insults or blows. In the weeks that followed, she tried to move on. Though the memories of his suffering still haunted him, he no longer had to live in constant fear. He threw himself into his work, trying to rebuild the life that Isoma had nearly destroyed. But then, 2 months later, shocking news spread through the village Isoma was dead. The man she had left Chai for was not like him. He was aggressive, violent, and refused to be controlled. One night, when Isoma tried to challenge him, he reacted in rage, pushing her so hard that she fell and hit her head on the floor. Out on the floor. She died instantly. Instead of reporting her death, the man panicked, locked her body inside the house, and ran away. Days later, neighbors broke down the door after noticing the smell, only to find Isoma's decaying corpse. When she heard the news, he didn't know how to feel. He had suffered so much at her hands, and yet he never wished for this. No one deserved to die like that. He felt a deep sadness, not for the woman she had become, but for the person she could have been if she had chosen a different path. Eventually, Chai found comfort in Awa, Isoma's old friend, who had also suffered in a violent marriage. Their shared pain brought them together, and over time, their friendship turned into love. A year later, they married, building a relationship based on mutual respect. After years of suffering, Chai finally found the peace and happiness he had always longed for. She had spent years enduring the worst kind of suffering, one that left no visible scars but slowly broke him from the inside. He had loved Isoma, believed in her, and sacrificed so much for their marriage, only to be treated as nothing more than a tool for her convenience. He had suffered in silence, too ashamed to admit the truth to anyone, knowing that society would never take his side. And yet, after everything, she had still left him, running off with another man and humiliating him one final time with her cruel farewell note. He had thought that was the end of it, that she was gone for good, leaving him to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. But then, 2 months later, the news spread like wildfire through the village. Isoma was dead. The man she had left Chai for turned out to be the opposite of him, domineering, aggressive, and completely unwilling to tolerate defiance. One night, when Isoma tried to control him the way she had controlled Chai, he lost his temper and shoved her violently. She fell, hit her head on the hard floor, and died instantly. Instead of seeking help, the man panicked, locked the house, and disappeared. Days passed before the neighbors noticed the overwhelming stench coming from the house. When they broke in, they found her decomposing body abandoned, left to rot in the very place she had once thought would be her escape from Chaya. When she heard the news, he was overwhelmed with emotions he could not fully understand. He had never wished harm upon Isoma, despite everything she had done to him. He had endured her cruelty, her abuse, and her betrayal, but he had never wanted this. The thought of her lifeless body, abandoned and forgotten, unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. He had spent so long resenting her, dreading her presence, and now she was simply gone. No more screaming, no more threats, no more fear, just silence. He thought back to the girl she had been when they first met, the kind, cheerful woman who had once appreciated his gentle nature. He didn't know when or why she had changed, but now she would never have the chance to. He attended her burial, standing at the back as the villagers whispered about her tragic end. Some pitied her, others condemned her, and many gossiped about how she had deserved what happened to her. Chai didn't say a word. He didn't know if she deserved it or not, but he knew that no one, no matter how cruel, deserved to die in such a lonely and brutal way. In the end, she had tried to control the wrong man, and this time there was no escape. In the weeks that followed, Chai found himself thinking less about Isoma and more about what he had learned from the experience. He realized that suffering was not exclusive to women. Men, too, could be victims of abuse, yet their pain was often ignored or dismissed. His story was not just about his own suffering. It was about the countless men like him who endured silently, fearing judgment, rejection, or even ridicule, but he had survived. He had walked through hell and come out on the other side. And as time passed, he found an unexpected connection with Owe Isoma's old friend who had also suffered in a violent marriage. Their shared experiences bonded them, and for the first time in years, Chai felt truly understood. Over time, their friendship blossomed into something deeper, and a year later, they married. Unlike his first marriage, this one was built on mutual respect, understanding, and kindness. Chai had finally found the peace he had always longed for. After years of pain and humiliation, he was no longer the timid, broken man who had once been afraid of his own emotions. He had learned the hard way that love should never come at the cost of one's dignity. And now, with Owa by his side, he was finally free to live the life he had always deserved. Chai's story was not just his own, it was a reflection of a harsh reality that many people, especially men, are forced to endure in silence. His journey had been one of pain, sacrifice, and betrayal, yet through it all, he had remained true to himself. He had been raised in a world that told him men must be strong, dominant, and never show weakness. When he failed to fit that mold, he was punished, ridiculed, and eventually cast aside by his own wife, who saw his kindness as a weakness to exploit. For years, he had lived under the control of a woman who took advantage of his gentle nature, stripping him of his dignity, forcing him into submission, and making him question his own worth. And yet, even after all the abuse, she still walked away, leaving him with nothing but the wounds she had inflicted. But in the end, life had its own way of balancing things. The very cruelty Isoma had used against him led her to her own destruction. The man she left him for was nothing like Chai. He was ruthless, unyielding, and unwilling to tolerate the same defiance Chai had endured. In trying to dominate him, she met the fate she had once forced upon another. Even with everything she had done to him, Chai never celebrated her downfall. He didn't feel joy at her tragic end, only a deep sorrow for what she had become. She had let her desire for control and power consume her, turning her into someone unrecognizable. And in the end, it destroyed her. On the other hand, had survived it. He had endured what many men could not even speak about: abuse, humiliation, and abandonment, and yet he was still standing. Through his suffering, he learned a lesson that society rarely teaches men. Silence is not strength. He had spent too long believing that enduring pain without complaint made him stronger, but in reality, it only made him suffer longer. Men, just like women, can be victims of abuse. The world expects them to be invincible, but that expectation is dangerous. It forces men into a lonely existence where they are afraid to ask for help, afraid to admit their pain, and afraid to be seen as anything less than strong. She had learned the hard way that no one should ever have to suffer alone. Abuse is abuse regardless of who the victim is. His story serves as a reminder that love should never come at the cost of one's dignity. A gentle heart should never be mistaken for weakness. True love is built on mutual respect, not control or dominance. Chi's suffering had led him to a new beginning, one where he was finally valued for the person he truly was. His marriage to El Wei was proof that happiness was still possible, even after years of heartbreak. But the lesson his story teaches is far greater than just one man's journey. It is a message to society as a whole. If we truly want to end abuse, we must be willing to acknowledge that victims come in all forms. Men should not be shamed for speaking up. They should not be forced to endure in silence. Strength is not found in suffering. It is found in the courage to walk away, to demand better, and to believe that love should never hurt.